Hello and welcome to another Hot Topic election special. I'm Hugh Riches. Due to technical difficulties at our end, I'm afraid I only have one candidate from the constituency of Hulton, Price and Howden. He is Edward Hart for the Labour Party, and to him I'm very grateful for coming along.
Thank you.
Ed, you've got a funny sort of constituency you're standing for, haven't you? It's rural, it's urban, it's agricultural, it's industrial. What are the main issues that you're facing in your constituency?
Well, yes, it is very varied, very widespread, but often some of the issues are fairly similar to other constituencies. Cost of living, people are very concerned about health service, access to services, access to social care services in rural areas is often a problem. Things like we have problems with GP surgeries closing in a place like Little Wheaton. That causes problems, especially for older people. Also flooding, that's an ongoing problem.
Well, we'll talk about flooding is very much a local problem here.
Yes,
the other things you mentioned are all aspects of national policy, health, social care, all those issues are aspects of national policy. How could a Labour government improve the health service?
Well, for instance, one of the first things that we will do is repeal the NHS and Social Care Act, because we feel that the health services is becoming increasingly fragmented under this government. At the moment, services are put out to tender under any willing provider. And from next year, any service that's a contract worth more than £625,000, for instance, will go out compulsory to tender. You know, we think this is wrong. We think the health service should be actually the preferred provider, because we don't want too much fragmentation. But also there's a financial aspect as well, and we will introduce mansion tax, bonus, bankers' bonuses, those sorts of things, put more money into the health service and integrate health and social care.
Just in terms of putting those services out to tender, perhaps other people outside the health service can provide a better service for less money and provide better value for the taxpayer.
But a lot of that is because the health service has been run down, and that's created capacity constraints. If you look at Hull and East Yorkshire hospitals, £100 million have been taken out of the budget as efficiency savings, not cuts, as efficiency savings. And that does have a big effect. We've lost 300 acute beds in Hull and East Yorkshire. We've lost the inpatients units for CAMS, for children and adolescent mental health services. You know, we've had a case recently where there's been a poor young girl cared for in the back of a police van because there's nowhere safe to take her.
But would a Labour government be able to put those beds back?
Certainly, that in the sense that we will fund the health service properly.
So a Labour government would spend more money on the NHS?
Yes, we want to introduce a time to care fund, which is worth £2.5 billion, and that's money for mansion tax, taxing the bankers' bonuses and cigarette companies. As a start.
How much would be enough for the NHS? Because it strikes me that unless you accept the fact of mortality, then the spending on the NHS could be infinite and eternal.
I think, I mean, I forget the name of the actual report, the chap who does it, off the top of my head, but I think he looked at it, an independent inquiry, and they were looking at under £8 billion. So the £2.5 billion would only be a start. We would have to look at other sources as well.
Now, you mentioned mansion taxes and cigarette company taxes. That's not going to be
tax
enough.
Avoidance. Tax avoidance is a massive
Add all
one.
that together, it's not going to be enough to...
Well, tax avoidance,
add
I mean, the state loses about £120 billion through tax avoidance, and I'm sure we could find £8 billion to claw back from them.
Well, I mean, but the matter of people not paying taxes that they already owe, that's not really a matter of policy, is it? That's a managerial thing. That's for the civil service.
But it is, because it can enable you to enact your policies.
Yes, I know, but if people aren't paying tax that they owe, then they're already committing a crime. They're already doing something wrong. No act of parliament, no act of politics can change that. It's just like saying that we've already got a political decision that murdering people is wrong. That doesn't stop people being killed.
If you read, what's his name, Owen, forgot his first name.
The Guardian writer who looks like a 12-year-old.
Yes, I mean, a very interesting point he made, the fact that the advisors to the HMRC, who advise the government on tax, are the same advisors that go advising the private companies on how to avoid tax. So these sorts of things need looking at.
Well, I mean, you can
Owen
always,
Jones.
You can always. Thank you very much. You can always have gamekeeper turned poacher, though, can't you? The chances are that both those operations require somebody who's an absolute expert in taxation. Now, experts in taxation can't be told because they've worked for Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. I'm sorry, but you can never work for a private company.
Well, maybe we should have our own experts that are loyal to the state and the public interest.
Well, you won't get them unless you pay them as much as the private companies and the banks in the city do.
Well, we shall see.
a happy thing.
But whatever, there's certainly a rich vein of funds there that could be used. There's certain people in society that aren't paying a fair way, and we've got services that we need to fund to look after our older people, for instance.
One of the other local issues you mentioned that's very important is floods. What would the Labour Party do about flood defences on the Humber in Yorkshire and Lincolnshire that the other parties wouldn't?
Well, I think a lot of it is about getting a more joined up approach between Yorkshire Water and the council. I think the part of the problem's been is that there's been a lot of buck passing.
But how is that different from what any of the other parties would do?
Well, there's probably a cross-party consensus in many respects that there's a lot of work that we need to do as a cross-party, because at the end of the day, flooding is a very long-term issue. It's going to go on, you know, if we don't take action, it's going to keep on happening. We've got climate change, so there's going to be increasingly heavy rainfall. So I think it's something that we need to work on as a cross-party basis. It might be that other parties are probably suggesting things, fairly similar things. Certainly, though, if you look at the Environment Agency, the budget has been cut, and I think we need to target that and make sure that we prioritise high-risk flood areas for funding.
I'm unfairly going to characterise what you've just said as that there is an all-party consensus that there should be less rain.
No, what I'm saying is it's something that people have to work together on.
Okay.
Because we all share the environment, but we all have to work together on it because it's such a long-term thing. As are other things. If you take, for instance, social care, there's a long-term problem in social care in terms of funding of that with an older population.
Can I just hold you to the environmental question here? Sadly, your Green Party rival couldn't be here, so I act as a little bit of a devil's advocate.
Okay.
What would be the Labour Party environmental policy?
Well, one of the things that we want to do is decarbonise electricity by 2030, and that's the big one. And certainly we've got the climate change conference in December coming up, international climate change conference in December, and we need a leader and the Foreign Secretary and all our negotiators really full on board with the agenda of climate change to actually cut global emissions, or to ensure that we take our part in cutting global emissions. So you need a government that really does believe that climate change is a problem. And sometimes I fear with some of the Conservatives that's not always the case. For instance, they're very, very anti-wind farms.
Is that official Conservative policy to be anti-wind farms?
A lot of their MPs aren't very happy about wind farms, to put it that way. I mean, David Davis isn't for a start. I mean, he's not here today, but he isn't.
He's the sitting member of Parliament.
He's the sitting member of
Conservatives at the moment in your constituency.
So we need to maximise renewables, certainly, to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. And we've got to be careful with things like fracking as well, because that releases CO2. It's still a greenhouse gas emitter as an energy source. So we can't. Fracking isn't the solution.
There's a nice connection here between the environmental policies and the economy in this part of the world is, of course, the renewable sector as the reason for vast investment onto the banks of the Humber. How would the Labour Party in power maximise the exploitation of that great resource?
Well, first of all, one of the things, and it links with another policy which we'll sure we'll go on to later, is actually ensuring that you create an economy that has the right right environment for investment in green technology. So we need to ensure that we maximise our renewables, have state backing for renewable energy, and give investors the confidence that the government is behind your investments. The other thing that we need to look at is, of course, the issue of Europe. I think there's a lot of uncertainty.
We'll come on to that in a moment, but
okay.
Just keeping it locally here in terms of the national government's influence on this area. What about infrastructure? I mean, if we're going to have the energy sector, that is going to potentially spawn all sorts of other aspects of the economy and activity here, but not unless there's massive investment in infrastructure.
Well, I think one of the big things is transport infrastructure, ensuring we've got a good railway service, road investments. We need to ensure that, because Hull, Grimsby hasn't been that well connected in the past. We're the forgotten part of the country, and I can guarantee you, as a Labour candidate, potentially Labour MP, I will do all I can to ensure that that's reversed for both the North Bank and the South Bank. I mean, I do have connections with the South Bank. I used to work in Grimsby, so I've got a soft spot for Grimsby as well. So I think the North Bank and the South Bank need to get together and really work to ensure we improve our transport, have better rail connections, better rail connections with the capital, but also roads. The road into Grimsby is pretty terrible, isn't it?
It's horrible. We've often mentioned it.
So, you know,
Corrugated
it's these sorts of things we do need to look at, but also we need to look at investing in the people, the local people, get them trained up so that they can take advantage of the opportunities that will be around, will be available. So we need to pump money into the colleges.
Well, we're going to talk about Labour's education policy, because the Labour Party very much wants to reverse some of the reforms made by this government, especially those under Michael Gove when he was Secretary of State for Education. What's your view on education in Holton, Price and Howden?
Well, I talk to other stressed out teachers. I think we need to look after teachers better. I also think, and this isn't actually necessarily part of Labour Party manifesto, this is out of the box a bit, we need to think about kids' well-being, children's well-being, because we don't look at the holistic side of education and preparing children for later life. There's a lot of children under a lot of pressure with exams and what have you. And I do think that we become too focused on figures and not human well-being. So that's one aspect. But Labour Party position is also, we want to ensure that every teacher that teaches in the school is qualified. That's not the case with the free schools. We want to ensure that class sizes for infants are limited to 30, say. And we will protect the budget.
Ed, thank you very much. We're going to have to stop there, I'm afraid. Please don't go away. Please join me again with Ed Hart, Labour candidate for Holton, Price and Howden, after this short break. Welcome back to Hot Topic Election Special. I'm with Ed Hart, Labour candidate for Holton, Price and Howden. Ed, we were just talking about education before we stopped. The reforms made by the Conservative Liberal coalition have tended to emphasise academic ability in school rather than merely vocational. What would be the Labour Party view of that? Well,
we want to introduce a vocational qualification for those children, to give them an option. Vocational qualification, absolutely fine, yes, and very important, of course, but we need something else for other kids as well that maybe are less academic. And maybe, perhaps they want to learn more technical skills, and we do have a shortage of skills in this country. Our productivity under this government's actually fallen because we have a skills shortage. So it's a very good thing to do, that we actually give children the opportunity to learn technical skills that will prepare them for the workplace. You say that, you emphasise the skills, preparation for the workplace. Do you regard education simply as a matter of producing economic units? Absolutely not, no. No, I mentioned earlier about well-being. I think we've got to focus also on well-being. We've got to give children the skills for life and try and give them tools to cope with stress and strains in life. Well, that's a sort of psychological training, how to respond to life. But do we not owe them the inheritance of 3,000 years of Western civilization? And that requires some sort of academic Oh, certainly. I mean, I love history. At school, I loved history.
And literature and music.
Absolutely. I'm a great fan of literature and history, and I would love to ensure that kids have the opportunity to explore that and have it introduced to them in a way that they can enjoy it. Well, that sounds much more like a grammar school style of education than the schools that the Labour Party... Why can't that be for all schools? Why can't, kids, every child should have access to Shakespeare? Why not? But some of them hate it. Some of them hate it, but then try something else. Okay, all right. We must talk about Europe. Your UKIP rival isn't here, I'm afraid, either. Presumably the UKIP candidate would say that we must leave Europe immediately. The Labour Party disagrees. Yes, we believe that Britain's place is at the heart of Europe. Definitely. If you vote for the Labour Party, you're voting for a pro-European party. We are quite concerned if we pull out of Europe, the effect on the economy will be quite disastrous, in fact. If you look locally, we just mentioned Siemens. Imagine the uncertainty if we pulled out of Europe to those big companies. A lot of big companies invest in Britain because we're part of a single market. Now, Norway, for instance, is out of Europe, but they still have to abide. If they want access to the single market, they still have to abide by European rules to get access. But they have no say in the matter about how those rules are developed. They've got no say at all because they're outside of the EU. So it's better to stay in and try and influence things best we can. It does cost us, though, doesn't it? It costs us a certain amount of sovereignty, and it costs us a certain amount of money in membership fees. Yes, but you've got to think of the trade, access to single market, as I've just said. And that's worth the loss of sovereignty? To some extent. But what we're also saying is, as a party, if any more treaties come about whereby powers are ceded to Brussels, we will hold a treaty referendum. Now, at the moment, there's no treaty in the offing, but that is our position. I mean, often it's about pooling sovereignty to strengthen your position. Countries around the world are coming together in regional blocks to pool powers and sovereignty to combat difficult problems like climate change, like social protection in terms of employment protection. A lot of our, I'm a committed trade unionist. I mean, our trade union is Unison. A lot of our employment protection actually comes from the European Union.
Well, talking about employment protection, the other point that UKIP would make and what they're campaigning on very heavily is immigration. Membership of the European Union means that we can't control our borders.
Immigration, I believe, it's been framed too negatively. I mean, if you look locally, if we didn't have Spanish nurses, Grimsby Hospital probably wouldn't function. If we didn't have immigration, we'd have crops rotting in the field. So it's got to be done in a way that it works for us and works for Britain and, of course, for the local communities.
Why wouldn't British workers go out and harvest those Brussels sprouts?
Maybe because it's short-term contracts, low-paid work, zero-hour contracts. I mean, that is another issue that we need to look at as well, of course. Protection for workers, because I do think recently, with the explosion of zero-hour contracts, it's a big problem in terms of living standards. We've also got to ensure that we ensure that people that come to Britain aren't exploited, that employers aren't allowed to undercut the labour market. So that means proper enforcement of minimum wage, for instance, and we will give local authorities powers to enforce minimum wage policy.
Now, why, in the recent budget, George Osborne said that Yorkshire had created more jobs in the last year than France. The economy seems to be looking quite cheerful at the moment. There's a reduction in unemployment and rises in productivity. Inflation is
productivity is quite poor, actually.
As low as it's ever been. And we have very low interest rates. The economy, it seems to be quite a fertile environment, the economy under the coalition. Why would you want to
living standards?
Why would you want to damage what they constantly refer to as their long-term economic plan?
Why would we're not damaging it at all? Living standards, I mean, under this government have actually fallen. I mean, there might have been a recent increase. That's only because inflation's very low. The reason why inflation's very low is because the oil prices have plummeted. Nothing to do with the government, it's because oil has plummeted on the markets. You've also got to look at the sort of jobs that are created. I mean, the TUC say there's been, like I've just said, an explosion in zero-hour contracts, in temporary work, in low-paid part-time work. You mentioned productivity. Actually, productivity is declining in Britain in terms of what workers, the output that workers are producing. It's actually in decline because we're becoming more of a low-waged labour market. And in terms of economic growth, my fear is that a lot of it's based on the housing market, and it's also based on consumer spending. It's not based on manufacturing and actually exporting, and we need to export. We've got the biggest trade deficit now in the UK since 1830, and that just is not sustainable.
You have your policy, if you were in power, would be to try to start paying down the deficit or reducing the deficit, but without necessarily paying the national debt and trying to pay that down. That costs, payment on the national debt costs about 6% of government spending. Why would you not want to pay down the debt?
We do, but it's got to be sustainable. It's got to be socially sustainable. And we would do it over a longer period than the Conservatives are actually suggesting.
Well, what period would that be then? Because
we were looking at clearing the deficit by the end of the next Parliament. That's the Labour Party position.
Well, that was what George Osborne promised to do in 2010,
and he hasn't.
And he's only done half of it.
Exactly.
So why will you be able to do it so much more ruthlessly
than George
Osborne has?
One of the reasons why the Conservatives have failed. I mean, they wanted the deficit now to be something like 35 million, sorry, and now it's 30 billion, 90 billion. So they've missed the target by about 60 billion. One of the problems is because, like I was saying earlier, we've got a low-waged economy, and a lot of people actually aren't even paying tax because the jobs that are being created don't pay enough money to pay tax. So
well, it's quite a good thing that you have a tax bracket with no tax as big as possible.
Because the jobs that are created, my point is that the jobs that are created have been very low paid. Now, we haven't had a proper rebalancing of the economy towards manufacturing, towards higher end skills. So what Labour will do is actually create an investment bank, a state investment bank, with regional state banks to help fund manufacturing.
Is this return of manufacturing realistic? I have visions of dark satanic mills and a
We've
19th
just talked
century
about
industrial revolution.
No, you can't go back. You can't turn the clock back. But we've just been talking about Siemens and green technology. I think Britain, with the scientists that we've got a lot of very clever people in Britain, and if we back them, we could do a lot for green technology and export.
We're sadly not joined by the Green Party or UKIP candidates here, but those two parties have grown so fast in comparison to disillusion with the three traditional parties. Now, the three traditional parties, it's quite difficult nowadays to find a philosophical difference between them. They're very bland. They all want about 43–45% of GDP to be going through government spending. Is that why you wind up, I won't call the Greens or UKIP extreme, but is that why you have more, it's not single issue either, but more eccentric parties growing up, because the three main parties are also
I think
uniform?
It could be more to do with us not getting our message across, because actually, in terms of spending, we're criticised one moment for spending too much, and then we're criticised for not spending it enough, so we can't really win.
The difference in spending, you'll be criticised from one side or the other, of course.
The difference in spending is something like 50 billion. So it's still quite a huge, significant amount. I mean, the Tories are looking at cutting back the public sector, public services in the next 2–3 years significantly more than they've already have done so.
All three parties want us, over a lifetime, to give about 60 or 70% of the money we make in a working lifetime in income tax and the VAT we spend, in pension tax, in
There's still
in
a
house
£50 billion
tax.
difference between what we would spend and the Tories would spend.
We're all expected to give more than half the value we earn in a working lifetime by all three parties to the state. And that's something that is causing dissolution. And is that the reason, nothing to do with the European Union or geopolitics or the science of the environment, is that why people are leaving the three main parties?
No, I don't think so. I think it's partly because you've had the main parties have been around for a while, and people start looking around after a while for a change.
18th century in some cases.
But we've got to get our message out and actually say, you know, we are the party of the people, and we've got a good policy agenda. We want to tackle living standards. We want to, you know, invest in our public services properly and manage the deficit by having a gradual reduction.
Can I just ask one further very quick question? Is Ed Miliband any good at being a Prime Minister?
Any good? He's not Prime Minister yet.
No, but would he
yes,
be any good at
certainly.
being a Prime Minister?
Anyone that's taken the stick that Ed Miliband has, unfairly, he's taken a lot of stick in the press. Anyone that's got that sort of broad back will make a very good Prime Minister.
And is he making a good leader of the opposition?
I think so, yes. I think he's moved the Labour Party in the right direction.
Ed, thank you very much for coming on. And sorry about the technical issues that mean that you're here all on your lonesome. I do apologise for that. And when I'll be interviewing all the candidates who are available for the constituency of Brigg and Goole, that is Andrew Percy. He will be joining me. Watch that at 8:30 on Thursday. Until then, thank you very much for watching Hot Topic Election Special. Hope to see you later on in the week. Goodbye.